Good evening, MedCircle YouTube viewers. I'm Kyle, the host here at MedCircle. Happy Mental Health Month. If you've not taken advantage of some great offers that we have going on for Mental Health Month, check the description below this video. I hope that many of you will not just join us here on YouTube in the future, but also over at MedCircle.com and watch.medcircle.com, where we do a lot of interview styles like the one you're about to watch or listen to right now. Today's topic is on emotional intelligence, personality types, and the mental health impacts therein. We're starting with two people who I'm sure you've seen if you've watched any amount of MedCircle. Neuropsychologist Dr. Judy Ho, all the way out in California, is joining us, and Dr. Dominic Sportelli, psychiatrist out in New Jersey, all the way on the East Coast. Dr. D, Dr. Dom, welcome, both of you.
So great to be here. What's up?
Dr. Judy, I would love to start with you to get a definition of exactly what emotional intelligence is.
Well, emotional intelligence is, as we've learned over research and with time and experience, something that is just as important as the traditional IQ and may even have more far-reaching applications. So emotional intelligence, or EQ, is the ability to understand, use, and manage your own emotions in positive ways to relieve stress, communicate effectively, empathize with others, overcome challenges, and diffuse conflict. So who can't use more of that, right?
Yes, no question. You just mentioned the EQ there. We'll refer to it as shorthand throughout this video. Dr. Dom, do you have anything to add to your definition of EQ?
Judy hit the nail right on the head, as usual.
Of course.
But yes, so I'll tell you what's fascinating about emotional intelligence is that so many people focus on what? IQ, intelligence quotient. And what we've realized over the course of decades is that there's so much more to intelligence. And when I say intelligence, I mean like the ability to be successful and the ability to be happy and the ability to live your life to the fullest. And emotional intelligence, as Dr. Judy explained and how she defined it, is so incredibly important. But here's the best thing about emotional intelligence, really quick, is that it can be a learned skill. So it doesn't necessarily have to be something that you're born with, although some people, have a little bit of an easier time with their emotions and understanding their emotions, but it's a skill. So you can practice it and get better and ultimately live a better life.
Well, let's talk about exactly how to do that. In order to understand this a little better, can we give some examples on how increasing someone's EQ could help them with their own mental health challenges? Dr. Dom, let's stay with you.
Yeah, sure. So let's think about something for a second. And I'm going to give you an example from a medical perspective. What if someone has pain, right? Generalized pain, and they go to the doctor, or they're just sitting there and they're saying, I have pain. Well, what does that really mean? We know that they're hurting. We know that they have some physical discomfort. But how can we address that? How can they address that? It's pain, right? It's unbelievably vague and generalized. Now, if they say, I have pain, it's sharp, it's shooting, it's in my lower right quadrant of my abdomen, then we go, hey, listen, appendicitis, let's work on that. Let's fix that. So my analogy is going to carry over to emotion and mood, right? So what happens when people are depressed? They go, I'm sad, I'm down, I'm bummed out. Well, what does that mean? Let's pay attention to that. And emotional intelligence allows us to think deeper about what that even means. What does sadness mean? Does it mean that you're frustrated? Does it mean that you're angry? Does it mean that, you're truly, mourning something? Is there grieving? What is happening exactly? So what it allows you to do is create a label for exactly what you're feeling so you can fix it. I think there's some old cliche out there somewhere that says, if you don't know what the problem is, it's impossible to fix it, right? And a lot of mental health is just that. It's like, I'm sad, I'm depressed. Well, let's learn how to identify the exact emotions that you're experiencing, and then let's address them. And studies have been done, and I'm sure Judy has seen these as well, fascinating studies where they look at people that have inability to understand their own emotions, and they do have a higher depression rate. They do have a higher anxiety rate. unfortunately, they do have a higher suicide rate, right? Because they can't really understand what they're going through specifically, and it just feels too overwhelming. So we do know that when someone's suffering with a mental illness, like an affective disorder or a mood disorder, being able to really understand and label, and we'll talk later about, the specific steps, but labeling is one way of doing it, of identifying that exact emotion.
Really great. It's also so great to talk to the two of you because you're not only experts in your field, but you're also parents. Dr. Judy, a brand new parent here. Dr. Judy,
Congratulations, that's right.
yeah, little baby Luca. So what would you look into as a parent and a neuropsychologist, Dr. Judy, to see if your child is really working and developing their own EQ?
Great question. And I look at my baby all the time and I'm like, this kid, he is definitely not shy about expressing his emotions. But I actually think that that's a good thing. That way I know what to do. If he looks upset, I'm like, okay, great. Let me go through my checklist of what to do to help him feel better. If he's happy, I'm like, great, I'm going to do more of what I'm doing now. But this whole idea of expressing emotions and allowing your child to express a range of emotions and not necessarily shutting off a specific type of emotion. I think a lot of times when you see your child in pain, expressing any kind of negative emotion, sadness, sometimes you want them to stop because it hurts you, right? To see them in pain. And so it comes from a good place, but it actually then teaches them that certain emotions are not okay. And good EQ means access to a variety of emotions, knowing that they all serve a function. They're evolutionary, placed there for a reason, and encouraging that expression without judgment. And so a lot of what you're looking for in your child is, do they know how to use emotion words? And you can teach them those emotion words. You can ask them questions so they can get at what emotion they're feeling. And then once they identify their emotion, you should really encourage that, as opposed to say, well, you feel sad. Well, you shouldn't feel sad. Everything's going amazing right now. Just say, okay, you feel sad. Mommy understands that you're feeling sad right now. Can you tell me more about that? Right? Ask more probing questions, get them to explore, get them to really understand their own emotional states and how to talk about them, and then teach them to ask for help. Well, what can mommy or daddy do to help you feel better now that you've told us that you're feeling sad today, right? What Dr. Dom said is right on. When people can't identify their emotions very well, and there's this very clinical term that we use in our field called alexithymia. It can come from all different kinds of reasons, but one of the causes of alexithymia for some people is growing up in an environment where emotional expression was not encouraged. So we definitely want to do whatever we can to start letting our children express a wide range of emotions and not shaming them for having negative emotions, because they're allowed to, and we are allowed to too. So sometimes I think when parents are trying to shut that down, that might also be some of our own upbringing. Maybe you grew up in a family where they didn't want you to express negative emotions. So really thinking about that and checking that, and just also recognizing that sometimes you do it and it comes from a good place. You just don't want your child to hurt, but the hurt will be over much quicker if you let them express it and then you problem solve it together.
Yeah, really well said. It echoes a lot of the same sentiments that Dr. Lamb and I talked about earlier today on YouTube. Really phenomenal, Dr. Judy. Dr. Dom, all that made sense what Dr. Judy just said. But then one day, these little cute little kids who are just learning their emotions are going to turn into 14 and 15-year-olds. And then they're going to have a different way of expressing their emotions. How does the emotional intelligence change in an adolescent, and what can parents do to navigate that time?
Oh my goodness. And as Dr. Judy has familiarity with a newborn, I have one of those. I have one of those 14-year-olds. So again, as we're talking, as fascinating as this is clinically, I do have my own examples as well. So first and foremost, teenage years are challenging. They're really, really hard for teenagers for the most part because of identity issues. And that's sort of when we're fostering our identity. We're learning who we are. We're trying to, on purpose, become independent. And as parents, sometimes we see that as rebellion. We see that as, kind of being difficult, but it's actually important that they do that and become more independent, because that's how they're going to grow. So While teenagers can be kind of difficult sometimes, actually part of that growth and independence is important, right? So you do have to give them some space. So first and foremost, allowing them to grow with some space. But what I would say is, as a parent, in order to develop emotional intelligence with your kids, I think probably one of the most important things out of all the lists that I know of clinically is live by example. Make sure you set examples. And what I mean by that is express your own emotions. Let your child know that it's okay to talk by expressing your own emotions to them. I mean, of course, you're not using your child as a therapist. What I mean more is be open about how you feel, right? Be open about how you feel with your kids so they know they can come to you if they have a problem or something like that. So not only share emotions on the negative side, but I think it's important to also share enthusiasm and share the positive things. Try to verbalize what you're experiencing when you're having amazing times in life, and when you appreciate things, and when there's gratitude, and when there's love. And like I said, it's okay to show that you're afraid or that you have, fears or some sadness or grieving, for example. But what I would also do is help them sometimes face hardships because they don't have the coping skills. So what a lot of teenagers might do is avoidance behavior. So if they're afraid or they're anxious or they're uncomfortable, they'll isolate. So I encourage parents to help their kids sort of push through that threshold by facing hardships and then sharing the feelings about what they're feeling by facing those hardships. So get them to talk to you about what it is that's happening, what it is that's deeper than just, I really don't want to go to school today, or I really don't want to go to that dance or that prom, or you know what, I don't want to see my friends tonight. There's so much more to that. Let's talk about what's happening. What are the feelings, right? Is there fear? Is there anxiety? Is there shame? Is there guilt? Try and work those things out. So have them share those feelings. And then, a couple of other things is when I say live by example, I also mean allow your children to see that you can see other perspectives and discuss other perspectives, right? So that's very, very important. That's dinner table talk, that's late night talk, that's after school discussions. But when something comes up, whether it's like current events or the news, make sure that you're allowing them or even pointing out to see other perspectives, right? So just make sure that they're thinking 360 and full circle. Other things that I think we do as parents sometimes too much, but is make sure that they understand body language and the power of body language, but not in a critical way. Not like sit up, sit tall, get your feet off the table. That's not what I mean. I mean, have them understand that, when they stand up tall with their shoulders back, it exudes confidence. And if they're hunching over, you say, it's kind of like a posture that seems like you're a little bit uncomfortable, right? So I'm a big believer in body language and helping them understand that as well. So a lot of tips with teenagers. Number one, live by example. Set a discussion to make sure that they see other perspectives. Help them face hardships and avoid avoidance, if that's kind of ironic, right? But help them kind of tackle and break thresholds by understanding exactly what they're feeling and not just bottle it up and avoid it. So those are some good tips. I use all those tips with my kids. It's definitely challenging and it takes practice, but good stuff.
Yeah, no question. Thanks, Dr. Dom. And for those of you watching live, in fact, for those of you watching live or the replay, if you're on your phone, there's a little share button. When you click it, it'll give you the opportunity to text or message it to people. It is I think this video and this panel discussion is a great thing to share, especially because it is Mental Health Month, because it touches on such a variety of topics that will help you no matter where you or your loved one are on their mental health journey. Plus, I would really appreciate it if you would share our amazing doctors with your friends and family close to you. I want to hear from each of you how, as adults, we can cultivate higher emotional intelligence. And I also want to understand what it will look like if I'm successful at this cultivation. I mean, really, what is my behavior? How does my behavior look if I'm like rocking the EQ? Dr. Judy, why don't we start with you? And by the way, Dr. Judy, when you were speaking last time, you said good EQ, and I thought you said good EQ, like goody Q. And I
Oh.
thought, Goody Q, Dr. Judy's rap name over here, Goody Q. So Goody Q, we'll go to you.
All right. So EQ. Well, first, we've been talking about this concept a lot, but this idea of cultivating self-awareness. So really having this ability to recognize and understanding your own emotions. And also not just knowing how to label your feelings, but actually being aware of the effect of your actions, your moods, and your emotions on the people around you. So to become self-aware, the way that you work on this is really monitoring your own emotions, not being afraid to check yourself and say, what am I feeling right now? Recognizing your reactions. And then after that, thinking about, if I was to act on this emotion urge, what would that do to my situation, the people around me? What's the effect, right? It's also important to really understand your own strengths and your own limitations with regards to your self-awareness. So again, sometimes we're aware that we are frustrated when we have to wait in line for a long time, but you're not quite there in terms of being able to actually modulate that frustration. Like, you know, you're like standing in line waiting for your coffee and you're like sighing really loud and rolling your eyes, and it's like hard for you to control that. And that's okay. Like, just recognizing that's an area that you need to work on is a good beginning step. You might not always knock it out of the park, and that's okay. But just even knowing, okay, I tend to do this when I'm in this situation, and this is something that I need to work on. Sometimes it can be scary, but you should ask for constructive feedback from people you really trust. So family members, good friends. When I did this the other day, like, how did that make you feel? You know, it's important, because otherwise you're just guessing at what your impact is in terms of how you're reacting on other people. And so tap into the people that you really trust, get that constructive feedback. That's going to really help you develop your self-awareness skills. I also think that it's really important to learn self-regulation coping strategies. So when you do know that you're in a negative emotional state, and when we're in negative emotional states, we tend to react more than act proactively. We can do things that later on we regret, messes that we have to clean up because maybe we lashed out verbally at somebody that we really care about or somebody we work with. And so we have to learn how to monitor and manage our own negative emotions when they come up. And so I think a big part of that is really learning different types of coping strategies when you have negative emotions. You guys probably have heard me talk about this, because this is one of my favorite emotion management skills, which is to physicalize your emotion. So pretend your emotion is a physical object in front of you. Give it characteristics, describe what it's like. This does two things. One, it takes that emotion away from you, knowing that it's not you. You're having the emotion, but it's like a completely separate entity from you. So you don't have to be identified by whatever emotion you're having. And secondly, anything in the physical world has a beginning and an end. So then everything feels like it's much more manageable, rather than when it's inside your body and your head, where it just kind of feels like it's amorphous and it's going to go on forever and ever and ever. And another piece that's really important to work on is your empathy skill. So empathy is the ability to understand how other people are feeling. This is absolutely critical to emotional intelligence. And it's really all about using active listening, truly being interested, not talking defensively or reactively, really being open-minded and actually being there just to hear what the person has to say, rather than already preparing your own statements. And then just being able to put yourself in that person's shoes and understand where they're coming from. And then from that very genuine place, that very caring place, deciding what action you'll take next. So building empathy is really all about practice. You got to practice active listening, giving people your undivided attention, and really having a conversation, not to speak, but to hear.
Yeah. Dr. Judy held a MedCircle workshop that I was a part of, and you had us, I think, draw out our anxiety or stress or depression or whatever it was. And then it was in a piece of paper and we had to crumble it. And honestly, y'all, I just thought, okay, I got to do this, whatever. So I'm doing all these activities, and I felt the relief. I felt the change. I felt the change from doing this activity, even with the mindset of, all right, I just gotta, kind of do this. These are really powerful techniques, and they do require practice, but even more than that, they just require you to do it at all. Some people will listen to you guys for hundreds of hours, and then they don't do any of the things you guys suggest, and it makes me frustrated, because I feel frustrated, rather, because these tools do work, and that's what's so great about what you're saying. Dr. Dom, I'd love to hear from you. We do have some questions to get to as well, and I know we're limited on time. So let's go into your tips on developing EQ, and then we'll go to some viewer questions.
Sure. Yeah. I want everybody to remember something that I think is really important. Emotions influence so much about our day and about just all of our experiences and the way we perceive our reality, right? So we know for certain with research that our emotions will absolutely affect our attention, our memory, our learning, our decision making. All of these things are affected by our emotions. So if we can regulate our emotions, so many of those things can improve. And as I stated earlier, if you can regulate your emotions, we do have data that shows that there's improved academic performance, improved relationships, improved marriages, decreased anxiety, depression. So we can't discount how important it is to sort of regulate our emotions, right? So as I said before, sort of having a vague understanding of what you're feeling kind of makes us feel more lost. So what I tend to use with clients when we're working on things like this, I'm sure Dr. Judy's very aware of this, a man by the name of Dr. Brackett from Yale University developed something that's used in schools very often, and it's called the ruler. It's like an emotional intelligence sort of skill set. And ruler, RULER, is an acronym, right? So it's like an easy way to remember these skills. And the first R in the word ruler is recognizing, right? So that just means, wait a second, pay attention. As Judy was saying before, I was thinking about it, right? And I'm definitely the guy that sits in line at Starbucks sometimes and I roll my eyes and then I have to say, wait a minute, hold on, pay attention. What's going on here? Why am I feeling this? What am I feeling?
Yeah.
Why do I feel frustrated? So first and foremost, recognize what's happening. Identify that emotion in yourself, okay? Then the U stands for understanding. So once you realize what the emotion is, try to figure out in your mind. And again, it's just paying attention to yourself. And you might not have these answers immediately, and it takes work. But working through understanding the U, the cause and the consequences of those emotions, right? So I'll just keep going with this whole standing in line in Starbucks. I'm frustrated. And I say, okay, hold on. What am I feeling? I'm feeling frustrated. Okay. That's the emotion. Let me understand this. Okay. I know why I'm feeling this because I'm in a rush and I know that I'm stressed and I know that I have to get back to work. But if I feel this way right now, the consequences of that are I'm going to feel irritable. Maybe I won't treat people well. Maybe I won't be able to concentrate. Maybe I'll forget things, right? So understanding the cause and the consequence of what you're feeling. And then the L in the word ruler is labeling. So labeling is actually interesting because what I do with clients is fascinating in the sense that we can look up emotional definition. Like there's emotional lists, like emotional word lists. And literally when you look at it, you wouldn't even believe it. It's like 4 or 5 pages long of words that describe what you're feeling. And when I show a client this and I say, you know what, you're telling me you're sad, but I want you to go down this list and I want you to pick exactly what you're feeling. So label it, give it a word, right? And now you can communicate those feelings better. And when you can communicate those feelings accurately, you're going to feel better. And it's also going to help you in another aspect where you're going to understand other people better. And that's why this helps with relationships, right? So far we have recognizing, understanding, and labeling. Then the E in the word ruler is expressing. So now that we're up to the point where we've labeled it, we understand it, all this, how do we express it? And how do we express it in the right way? So I'm standing in line at Starbucks. I can get angry. I could yell at somebody, or, I can do it in a more productive way where I can use it in a social situation skillfully, right? And then I want to model that acceptable social behavior to my kids, as I said before, as to other people in our relationships, things like that. And then finally, the R in the word ruler, RULER, is regulating. So regulating is basically coping strategies, right? Be more effective in feeling that emotion, regulating it, as Dr. Judy said, there's various techniques to do that. But that's the final goal, because we're going to experience emotion. We're going to experience positive emotions and negative emotions. But if we can regulate those emotions by expressing them, by labeling them, by understanding them, and of course, by recognizing them, we're going to do so much better overall. And briefly too, I think I want to touch upon something that you said before, Kyle. You said, when people have good emotional intelligence, like how does that affect their life in a positive way, right? So again, we see self-esteem increase. People are more assertive. They can manage their emotions. They can self-regulate so much better. So they're better in groups. So these people tend to work better in groups, which means they're more productive at work. They're non-impulsive. They make better decisions. And get this, they lead a healthier lifestyle. So people that can regulate their emotions actually are more physically healthy. So there's so much to this, both medically and psychologically. So you guys can look that up. It's a gentleman by the name of Dr. Brackett. He's out of Yale. It's the acronym RULER of the emotional intelligence coping strategy.
I really love this ruler method. And I want to point out to our viewers as well, one really fabulous thing that you've not heard any of the doctors say is, well, don't feel angry, or you're not supposed to feel that way. Our feelings are our feelings, and they come and they go. These are strategies to identify them, label them. I don't need to belabor or reiterate what they said, but no one was saying, well, why are you angry being at Starbucks? You might be angry being at Starbucks. You're allowed to be angry being at Starbucks. You can do whatever you want. Let's go to some questions from viewers, please. This one's for Dr. Judy. Acceptance and commitment therapy question. How can someone with PTSD or other debilitating mental health conditions with triggers use self as context? What a question, Dr. Judy.
Yeah. So, again, I think self as context is really about your self, this part of yourself that has seen you through all the trauma, all the stresses of your life, and is still completely whole, completely intact, pure. The essence of that is a continuous essence, as opposed to what a lot of people, when they've experienced traumatic events, will say that they feel like their self is discontinuous, like it's kind of jumbled all together, and that there are times when they don't have that intactness with the sense of self. So one of my favorite analogies for self as context is to imagine a chessboard. And the chessboard is witnessing hundreds, if not thousands, of games being played on the chessboard, right? There's different players, they use the pieces, and every single chess battle has an outcome, but then it's the next chess battle with the next set of participants. And the chessboard, throughout all of these different chess games, is still the same chessboard. It's witnessing all of these games. Sometimes one side wins more than another side on a given day. Sometimes certain chess battles are more intense than others. But the chessboard is the one that witnesses all of it. And it's not changing, or it's not taking sides. It's just there to witness everything that happens. And no matter what happens on the chessboard itself remains intact. And so that's a good analogy for yourself as context, the part of yourself, despite all of the different stressors and traumas you've been through, it is still whole. It is not attached to a specific outcome or an event. And it's that part of yourself that you can go back to whenever you're feeling the trauma well up again and thinking about yourself as maybe somebody who's broken or who needs fixing. You can go back to this analogy. Another quick analogy that might work for people who want an additional analogy is sort of thinking about when people are watching a show or a play. So we have the actors on the stage. They're obviously very invested. There's the narrator who's narrating everything that's going on. And then there's the audience. And the audience is like the self as context. So you're interested in what's going on. You're watching the story, but at the end of the day, it doesn't have to be the only story. You can watch another play the next day, and you're an audience member witnessing all of it and observing it, but not passing judgment.
Really well said. I love a good analogy, Dr. Judy, and you gave us two. Dr. Judy has a fabulous series on ACT. I don't know how many times I've said that exact sentence. Dr. Judy has a fabulous series on ACT, but she does. We'll link to it in the description. Go watch it. Literally go watch it. It's the best. I don't even want you to leave, but if you did leave this live stream to go watch it, I'd be like, well, that makes sense. Dr. Dom, I bet we have a question for you. Let's go to that. Dr. Dom, can you please share an effective method of stopping negative, worried thoughts as they come up?
Oh boy. Yeah. So this happens often, right? And
All day.
yeah, all day, right? So this is natural. And so they're going to happen. These negative thoughts are going to happen. And the the interesting thing about negative thinking is that when you try to avoid negative thinking, it actually pops into your head. And there's that old story of saying, okay, don't think of a pink elephant right now. Well, you probably just thought of a pink elephant, even though I told you. Or if I say, don't think of the plane that you're on crashing, that's what you're going to think of, right?
Yep.
So what we have to do is sort of understand, and this was kind of what you were saying before, Kyle, how we're not telling people not to feel emotion. What we're doing is allowing them to feel the emotion, understand it, process it, label it, and just put it aside. Just let it go. Just kind of let it go, kind of let it fall through. So there are various things that we can do when we have negative thoughts popping into our head. Now, one, again, Dr. Judy's a pro at this, is like a cognitive behavioral therapy approach where you're recognizing exactly what that thought is. What is that thought, right? What is the bad thought that just popped in, right? And what I like to tell clients about is the cognitive behavioral therapy approach. So when that thought pops into your head, realize it, identify it, try to think about it in a cognitive framework where you're saying, is this thought really valid? Am I doing something like overgeneralizing or jumping to conclusions or doing a black and white type of thinking or catastrophizing? So I always tell people, in our minds, we have the judge, which is your own sort of ego and mind. And you have that prosecuting attorney who's always throwing those bad thoughts at you, but we don't have a defense attorney there. We just don't have anyone as a defense attorney to sort of stick up for the bad thought, to stick up against those bad thoughts. So pretend that you have a defense attorney. So the bad thought pops in and you say, okay, I just got this thought. This is uncomfortable. What exactly is this thought? I'm identifying it. And then the defense attorney is going to say, I object. This is why this thought is probably invalid. This is why this is probably not going to happen. This is probably why this is an overvalued idea. This is probably why you're jumping to conclusions, right? That defense attorney. And this is a process, and this is also practice. This is another skill that you have to sort of practice over time with a cognitive behavioral framework. And I often use the analogy, psychiatry and psychology is not much different than physical health, like going to the gym. I can preach to you all day about how to get six-pack abs and have a great body and lose weight. But if you don't do the activity, it will never come to fruition. So you have to practice these skills. So I would use a cognitive behavioral therapy approach as one approach. Of course, if you're practicing something like mindfulness, where you have the ability to allow a thought to come in, recognize it, but don't attach to it and let it sort of flow. So things like practicing mindfulness, learning cognitive behavioral techniques, I think that's incredibly helpful for when those bad thoughts pop in.
Yeah, no question. I can attest to that as well. Let's go to another question, please. This question is for Dr. Judy. It looks like we've already had this one. Can we have a different question? For both of you guys, we'll start with you, Dr. Judy. Do you have any advice for how to not take on other people's emotions and feelings? I feel like I'm too empathic, and I deeply absorb and embody others' emotional state.
Yep, really great question. And so I think this comes on the heels of a lot of research that we know now that there is such a thing as vicarious trauma when we're a little too empathetic, especially when we're often in a giving role, either professionally or personally or both. And this idea of empathy is an important one because we still want to be able to be there for the people that we love and care about, and maybe the people that we're helping to serve if this is part of your career. But we don't want to take their emotions all the way home so that they become our own problems, because that actually takes away from your ability to be able to do your best. So there's actually two different types of empathy. There's emotional empathy and there's cognitive empathy, and people sometimes don't recognize that. So emotional empathy is generally what we're talking about when we talk about empathy. We say, well, we want to know what it's like to be in the other person's shoes. We want to know how they're feeling. But sometimes, especially if you're somebody who might be more sensitive by nature in terms of just your emotional sensitivity, you're going to adopt too much of that person's emotions and do exactly what this viewer is saying. It feels like you're taking on everything in their entire world. So this might be a good time to actually transition and be flexible between this idea of expressing emotional empathy or cognitive empathy instead at different times. So cognitive empathy is also known as empathic accuracy. There's a lot of different definitions of this, but one definition is having more complete and accurate knowledge about the content of what another person is feeling and thinking. So
I
this
love
is
that definition.
yeah. So this is more about like understanding their emotional state rather than like putting yourself in their shoes so that you feel their emotional state.
Right.
And since we've been talking about EQ this whole time, this is part of EQ. So if you are able to accurately identify what it is that they're talking about in their experience, you're still able to help them in a very personalized way. But then you're not putting yourself in their shoes and saying, wow, let me try to imagine if I lost my job and I've been applying everywhere and it's been a year and I still haven't gotten a job. Wow, if I really put myself in that position, I really imagine that, that makes me feel so depressed, right?
Right.
But cognitive empathy would just say, okay, I understand what this person is telling me. I can see how that could be devastating, but I'm not putting myself emotionally in their position, because sometimes when you do that, you're actually less able to help them.
Yeah. And the two types of empathy you just discussed, because I have not heard of this, cognitive empathy and emotional empathy.
Yes.
Really great. Thank you, Dr. Judy. I can
Of
use
course.
that. Dr. Dom, any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, it's interesting that you guys that question was brought up, because there's actually something that doctors and psychiatrists and psychologists can experience, and it's actually called compassion fatigue.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, it's a very real thing, and we notice this a lot with coronavirus, unfortunately, at the hospital, with a lot of some of the devastation that we've seen. And I work in the emergency department, so we see a lot of challenging things, and there's also in psychology the term countertransference, where we can sort of take on other people's feelings and sort of be affected by it. So most importantly, I think it's important to sort of educate yourself on understanding when you start to become affected by other people's sort of emotions, and that compassion fatigue starts affecting you negatively. So make sure you're paying attention to that. And listen, that can be symptoms yourself of feeling sort of burnt out, or feeling like you're starting to lack empathy, or feeling like you're not feeling anything anymore, or even just feeling even physically sick. Things can change in your life when you're dealing with so much empathy interaction, right?
Yeah.
So first of all, educate yourself on it, understand what that even is, understand what the signs of that sort of empathy burnout are. But I think more importantly is understand boundaries. So boundaries are very, very, very important. And just because you have boundaries, and because you're looking to help someone from an objective standpoint, it doesn't mean that you need to absorb exactly what they're feeling. Sometimes being supportive to someone doesn't mean that you even have to understand what they're feeling, right? So, there's various ways of talking to people and allowing them to speak and be supportive without letting it hook you and sort of draw you in emotionally, right? So just understand boundaries and look at things a little bit more objectively instead of subjectively, because what we tend to do, and as Judy was saying, is that we tend to relate everything to what we've experienced. So if I'm listening to someone who's going through a challenging time, my mind wants to recreate something that I've experienced to sort of bring myself into that and feel it as they're talking and say, oh my God, I know exactly what you're talking about. This is what I felt. And it sort of starts to become about you as well. And now you're sort of drawn into it and kind of enmeshed in it a little bit. So understand that you can be objective. You can sit back without feeling it yourself, in the sense of without trying to sort of think of a way that you can relate. You don't have to do that. Supportive psychotherapy in general is validating what someone's feeling and just listening. and making sure that those boundaries remain. So, educate yourself on compassion fatigue, educate yourself on the symptoms of compassion fatigue, and understand that it's okay to have boundaries, and it's okay to not enmesh your own feelings and your own experiences all the time with what someone else is saying to you in order for them to feel understood.
Well said. And we have a great series on compassion fatigue featuring Dr. Judy. It's in the comment section of this video. And if you are a professional and of any kind, we have a number of professional discounts to MedCircle. MedCircle is separate than YouTube. We do have a great YouTube channel, but we also have a membership, which a lot of professionals use. So if you would like to claim that discount, go to support@medcircle.com or email support@medcircle.com. Dr. Dom, Dr. Judy, fabulous to see each of you. Dr. Dom, it's late where you are. You're probably close to bed. And Dr. Judy, end of the day for you. Thank you both for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you
Always a pleasure, guys. Great to see you.
All right,
Great
bye,
to see
guys.
you all. Bye.
Often when we talk about mental health, we put a focus on what's wrong, what's going on in our life that is bad or isn't working, or what feelings are we experiencing that don't feel comfortable or good. And there is a lot of value in asking those questions and getting to the bottom of it. But there is also value in asking the question, what is going right? And what are some of your strengths? Person-centered therapy is a therapeutic approach that Dr. Ramani and I discussed. And we have a wonderful clip from that discussion for you right now. Now, we're talking today about person-centered therapy. This is something I've not heard of. So why don't we start with what that is?
So person-centered therapy comes out of the work of Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers was a humanistic psychologist. And interestingly, to sort of frame it in modern times, person-centered therapy was really the forerunner to positive psychology. Carl Rogers, at the time, it really was quite revolutionary what he was doing. He really was pushing back on the sort of dysfunction-oriented perspective of psychology and was really wanted to ask the question, instead of asking what's wrong with people, he's like, let's focus on what's right. So person-centered therapy is exactly what it sounds like. It's not about technique. It's not about the therapist being the authority. It's very much setting conditions of growth, and that the person is the focus, not the wisdom of the therapist, but the person. And that this is a form of therapy where it's more in the being than it is in the doing. So the presence of the therapist in a very specific sort of way, that certain presence that the therapist learns, that's actually believed to be what creates the conditions of growth. And Carl Rogers believed, and as do anyone who's a humanistic psychologist or therapist believes, that all human beings have within them the capacity to sort of to take care of themselves and to grow and to be their best version of themselves. So again, it's a very positive, person-centered therapist, not as authority model.
So when I hear that, I feel like it could treat nearly anything or be used for anything. Is there anything that it's not great for?
I would say that if somebody is having an acute psychiatric crisis, so for example, they're experiencing really debilitating depression, or they're experiencing psychotic symptoms, they're dealing with an active substance use disorder, or they're experiencing pretty significant eating disorder. Because there's so many acute issues in those cases, I might argue that it becomes important to make sure that the client is medically stable and functionally stable. And then once you get them to that point of stability, I do think that there's a lot of utility for a person-centered approach. Keep in mind too, though, Kyle, the person-centered approach isn't a technique. Like I know on MedCircle, you've talked about things like DBT or motivational interviewing. Those are techniques. Person-centered therapy is really about how the therapist is present in the therapy. So I do think that a person-centered model, if you will, could be combined with any therapeutic approach sort of out there as sort of how the therapist is. But ultimately, I do think when there's an acute crisis, you do have to get the client safe and functional. And so but a person-centered therapist would argue, I am still going to draw from those critical conditions of therapy: unconditional positive regard, congruence, empathy, all of that. Like, I'm going to be present with this client. That's a condition of therapy. I don't know. And I think a lot of humanists would argue person-centered therapy is not a technique. It's just sort of a state of being as a therapist.
So I could be a CBT therapist, but overlay a person-centered style with it.
You could. I think that a lot of CBT, here's the problem. CBT and person-centered therapy in some ways are sort of at odds with each other a little bit. And what I mean by that is that the CBT therapist is very directive. There is a presumption of authority, right? The CBT therapist is giving homework and they're saying, do this, and I know this.
Yeah.
I got to tell you, Kyle, it's really interesting. In the person-centered model, you really are taking the stance of, you know you better than I know you.
Yeah.
But I've often, and since graduate school, I've often viewed person-centered therapy as a very much a parental model, like where the therapist is actually being what a parent should be, which is present, available, non-judgmental, providing unconditional positive regard, approaching the person with genuineness. So it's creating this kind of, the way I would describe it is like if you're a painter and you're preparing the canvas to get the paint, right? So you're doing all this work so you can finally make your beautiful painting. The therapist is almost preparing the canvas. Then they're saying to the patient, paint. They wouldn't even call them a patient. Carl Rogers would never use the word patient. It's too medical. They use client, and then it really has gotten elevated to person, because even client implies a transactional relationship. And sure, person-centered therapists ain't doing this for free. So sure, there's a transaction. But by calling someone a client, it still implies that you're in very different roles in that room.
Now, what is Rogarian therapy, if I'm even pronouncing that right?
So Rogarian therapy is person-centered therapy. So remember, Carl Rogers, who actually back in the day practiced right here in Santa Monica, California. He was, so it's that entire humanistic focus came out of the work of folks like Carl Rogers. Ahead of Carl Rogers actually came someone named Abraham Maslow, which is a name that many of you may remember from an undergraduate psychology class. Remember that pyramid, that hierarchy of needs, where at the bottom of the pyramid was like food and water, and then at the very top of the pyramid it was self-actualization. That concept of self-actualization is actually sort of the goal of humanistic sort of attainment. Maslow set that, Rogers, and then sort of took it from there into this sort of person-centered model. At the time, Kyle, frankly, it was quite revolutionary, because the psychoanalytic model was all about unconscious conflict, the analyst as the expert. In fact, you weren't even looking at the analyst in orthodox analysis. You were in a sofa or a couch looking the opposite way. The therapist had their back to you, the analyst had their back to you. So that was a very, very different model. The person-centered therapist is very warm, present, genuine, positive, again, believing in the growth capacity of the client.
I'm sure this will become more clear as we continue on, but when you say all those things, that sounds like almost every therapist I've ever had. They're naturally warm and compassionate. Is this something that are there notes of this that we see across most therapists or most good therapists?
So I'm going to respectfully disagree with you and say that you've actually had a wonderful experience then.
Or hey, maybe it's just me painting the history with brighter colors. Who knows?
Yeah, perhaps so, because I have to say not all therapists are warm. Some therapists are actually quite remote, and it really, and some of this comes down to theoretical model. Some of this comes down to individual differences between therapists. Some therapists are incredibly directive. Some therapists are very critical. Some therapists are very judgmental. None of that's going to work in this model. I agree with you. When we look at the sort of the essential ingredients of what a therapist is meant to be in a humanistic or Rogarian or person-centered model, I'm going to be frank with you. That's what I think a good person is.
Yeah.
That's really, whenever I read Rogers, I'm like, this is what we should all be. And if we were all like this, wouldn't this be a wonderful world? Yeah. But so the fact that Rogers laying this out as a theoretical model and it almost feeling groundbreaking really speaks to up to that time, which was about the 50s, 60s, 70s, that think of how therapists were. Remember, therapy was not normative at that point. People in the 60s and 70s, you were seeing the beginning of people getting into therapy in the 60s, but it was really only super affluent people. It was very much a disease model therapy. Like, how do we fix what's broken? But we're still there, Kyle. I mean, the way insurance companies work and all of that, it's like, we got to have something to fix. We're certainly not paying for you to get self-actualized. That is not on the menu. And so that the way we sort of manage healthcare in our country is never about growth or improvement. If in that case, then insurance companies could then pay for personal trainers or exercise classes. Frankly, they should be, because that'd be a great way to keep people out of the hospital.
Yeah. You mentioned humanistic psychology at the top of this interview. Can we go into more in depth on what exactly that is and how it relates to this?
So the humanistic model of psychology is a very sort of positive view of humanity. This sort of belief that all people at their core are trustworthy, that they're resourceful, all human beings have an inherent sense of insight, and that they can be self-reflective, that they're able to, that everybody actually has the inherent capacity to figure themselves out without a therapist. But a therapist is often there to help them sort of bring down their own defenses, like this idea of anxiety. Anxiety is sort of a defensive approach to a world that puts conditions of worth on people. So what a humanistic approach believes is we all have this potential to be these really, really self-actualized, evolved human beings. And the thing that blocks us from getting there is usually society telling us we're wrong, we're bad, we're not good enough, putting conditions of worth on us. So the humanistic model is actually an incredibly, like I said, it's a very positive view of human beings. It's very growth oriented, in that we're all oriented towards growth. So that's the whole focus of that model. Like I said, it's the forerunner of what in about the 80s and 90s people like Martin Seligman ran with and started calling positive psychology.
Don't you just love Dr. Ramani? Really, really great to listen to her. That workshop is available to MedCircle members that you can access at watch.medcircle.com. We have two more incredible doctors joining us for the second half of this panel interview. We have Dr. Christy Lamb. You might have seen her earlier today on our YouTube channel, psychiatrist out of Southern California. Oh, there she is. Dr. Lamb, nice to see you. I believe we also have Dr. Thuslam.
Hey, everyone.
Oh, we do. Hello. It's so great to see both of you. I'm going to ask you both of this question because it's one of my favorite topics. It's on resilience. How does someone's resilience, whether they have a lot of it or they're lacking in the department, how does that impact their emotional intelligence, their EQ? Dr. Lamb, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So when we think about resilience, we're talking about the capacity to kind of stick with something, even in the face of adversity. There are multiple different characteristics of people who are considered resilient. There's people who have grit that lets them kind of stick with it even when it's hard. But I would suggest that people who have long-term resilience know when to pull out the grit card and really push through, and also know when they need to take a break. And we talked about this in one of our earlier talks about resilience. And so I think that in order to have sustained resilience, we really do have to have an emotional intelligence to be able to, it's kind of like meta process, to meta understand what's happening, when our feelings are coming up, what's happening when our anxiety gets high, or when the energy in the system has dropped, that we have an attunement to ourselves. And I think this is a core characteristics of people who have a high emotional intelligence. They understand emotions, they don't fear them, and they understand their purpose and utility, and then can then use them to decide, do I need to pull out the grit card and really push through on this? Do I need to rest, restore, so that I can be resilient for the long term? So I think they go hand in hand, that I would suggest that emotional intelligence is a core capacity that's necessary for long-term resilience.
I love the teasing out of grit versus resilience. I think I have been mistaking grit for pure resilience when there was probably some nuances there. Psychologist Dr. Thuslam, all the way up north in Canada. Any response?
Yeah, I would 100% agree with Dr. Lamb. I think emotional intelligence is an essential component of resilience. We really do need to understand our emotions. We need to understand what to do with our emotions. And when we can do that, that's how we are able to be resilient. So, like as Dr. Lamb was saying, being able to figure out what do I need in this moment? Do I need to push harder? Do I need to kind of stand back? Do I need a hug? Do I need
Yeah.
to go have a night out? What is going to allow me to not only kind of maintain myself and sustain this level, but what's going to allow me to overcome any kind of obstacles that I experience? And if we don't have the ability to, at least that kind of first component of emotional intelligence, which is really about the self, if we don't have that, then we don't know how to take care of ourselves, or at least it becomes a lot harder to do that in an
Mhm.
effective way, which then makes it so much harder to be resilient effectively as well.
Dr. Thussum, I'd like to stay with you. You work with patients and clients who have experienced trauma, and I'm curious to see how developing a higher EQ, if that's even the right way to put it, while also recovering and coping and dealing with this trauma, how those two things play together at once.
Yeah, it's a great question, Kyle. I think part of um, a lot of mental health struggles is not really knowing what's going on within us. And so
Oh,
many
yeah.
people have what we call like a blunting or an avoidance approach to their emotions, especially the uncomfortable ones. But when we're emotionally intelligent, we're much more likely to think about our emotions, to process our emotions, to see our emotions as healthy and helpful. And when we do see our emotions as healthy and helpful, we're much less likely to experience significant and severe symptoms of mental illness. It doesn't mean that we won't, but our ability to recognize that no matter what we're feeling, it's part of our human experience makes that suffering just a little bit less. And so when we're talking about that within the scope of trauma, research actually tells us that when we are emotionally intelligent, we're actually less likely to develop symptoms of PTSD because we're using that kind of approach processing strategy for our emotions rather than the avoidance strategy, which usually leads to or can contribute to symptoms of PTSD and the likelihood of developing PTSD. So that's kind of from like the perspective of developing PTSD. Now, if we talk about someone who has PTSD or is experiencing symptoms of some sort of trauma disorder, if we're building our emotional intelligence, part of what we're doing, at least again from that kind of self perspective, is we're learning about our emotions, which means that we're kind of deciding, okay, I feel scared right now. I feel nervous right now. I feel hesitant right now. I feel concerned right now. And the more labels we can put on it, the more signals we can understand within our body, the more we know how to respond to them and how to respond effectively. I think the
Mhm.
other really nice thing that happens when we're building our emotional intelligence is we're learning to connect with others. And being able to connect with others allows us to feel less isolated. And we know that mental illness can be such an isolating experience. And so when we're able to understand what others are going through, when we're able to build healthy relationship dynamics with others, we're less likely to feel isolated. We're less likely to be consumed by shame or by fear. And so that emotional intelligence and working on our emotional intelligence is also likely to contribute to less suffering when we're experiencing a mental illness like PTSD.
Really fabulous. And I love how you ended that. You put your hands down like, boom, there's your answer, Kyle. Okay. So, Dr. Lamb, who I go for in all things anxiety, there are some of us who are just more anxious. Okay. I have friends who are just a little more, they're a little more anxious. And I have friends who are not anxious at all. How can our level of anxiousness impact our ability to develop higher EQ?
Great question. Yeah. And I would say that it can be bi-directional, meaning that first and foremost, if I'm really anxious, often my brain's going to kind of go offline, and it's hard for me to metacognize, to think clearly about what's going on, to be able to be present with what's going on, to do all of the things, right, that were just talked about in regard to PTSD. How do I understand what's happening, normalize my feelings, embrace what's going on, and make sense of what I've been through? If I'm flooded with anxiety, I'm not going to be able to do that. And so high levels of anxiety can make it very difficult for people to process, be present with, and notice their feelings. And so I would suggest that there's the effect of anxiety on being able to be emotionally intelligent around our feelings. And then in order to navigate our anxiety, we need a level of emotional intelligence. Part of that is just straight psychoeducation. In my view, emotional intelligence, there are certainly some people who kind of come out of the womb, understanding certain things and empathizing in certain ways. But I do think that a lot of this is very teachable, which I think is hopeful for those of us who may have come out with, other strengths. And so the idea being that if I can learn about how my nervous system operates, so if I can understand what my feelings are, how I would notice them in my body, what they are telling me. Anger lets me set a boundary. Guilt helps me repair, right? All the things that our feelings are, the data that it's giving us, it can be incredibly helpful, but we can't always access that when we're in a high anxiety state. And for those of us that are, and I say us as I am in this group of the kind of higher anxiety folks, before we can get to the feeling piece, we actually have to have an emotional intelligence around our anxiety. So understanding when I'm anxious, noticing in my body what that means, getting an understanding of how to regulate my anxiety, depending on how high or low it is, what I need, so that I can then be in the state to do that deeper work of getting clear about what I'm feeling and why. And so I think anxiety plays a huge role in our capacity to engage with building our emotional intelligence.
Very interesting. If you have a question for Dr. Thuslam or Dr. Christy Lamb, please submit it below and we'll try to get to as many as possible. Here's a question for both of you. Can we leverage our emotions? Well, I already know the answer. We can't. So how can we leverage our emotions in order to build EQ? Dr. Judy and Dr. Dom gave us some interesting feedback for a similar question. I'd love to get your responses as well. Dr. Thuslam, why don't we start with you? What can we do? How can we manage and feel our emotions to develop better EQ?
Yes, it's a hard thing. So let me start.
Oh, darn it. Dude. Well, then never mind. If it's too difficult, let's not do it.
Not too difficult,
Okay,
but it
good.
takes motivation. And I think that's one of the underlying factors with emotional intelligence as well, right? We have to be motivated to engage in this process. And I think for so many of us, we grow up learning to shut our emotions out, learning that our emotions actually get in the way of our goals instead of learning that our emotions facilitate our goals. Our emotions are essential for survival. Our emotions are beautiful. And so when we
sound like Dr. Lamb, Dr. Thuslam.
You're in good company.
Yeah. You guys must have had a conversation before this. Okay. Sorry, keep going.
We're on the same wavelength, which is nice. That I think if we can start to pay attention to what our emotions are telling us, that's kind of that really baseline step of developing emotional intelligence. And so some of the things that we can do, as Dr. Lamb was just talking about, is paying attention to what's going on in our bodies. And so being able to notice, and I kind of call it like when your body is screaming at you or when your emotions are screaming at you, right? Paying attention to when your heart is racing or when you're noticing your body getting warm, and being able to just pause and say, hey, something's happening here. What is it? And what is my body? What is my brain? What is my spirit trying to tell me right now? I kind of think of emotions as little soldiers, and the soldiers are there to warn us and to protect us. But if we don't listen to the single soldier that comes, the whole army is going to come, and then we're going to feel the impact of the entire army. And so being able to start when the whole army is there and at least paying attention to that, and that will build the awareness so that even when we're at, if we think about a scale of like 0 to 10, when we're at a 1 or a 2 or a 3, we're starting to notice, hey, I'm feeling a thing right now. Let me pause and think about what it is that I'm feeling. And so that first kind of noticing and pausing is really helpful. Then I like to pull out my emotions wheel, which I think we've talked about here before, but it's an image where it kind of goes through the basic emotions, and then it expands to give us more vocabulary to allow us to describe the nuances of our emotional experience. And so if we don't have those emotions, learning to use that wheel helps us figure it out. And sometimes it might just be like, I don't know, and that's okay.
Mhm.
But the more we practice, the more we pull it out, the more familiar we get with it. So I think that's the next thing. And then I think maybe the third thing, which I find really helpful and I talk about with my clients, is to figure out, if you think about that scale of like 0 to 10 again in terms of intensity, what does an 8 in anger look like? What does a 7 in frustration look like? What does a 3 in sadness look like? What does, a 5 in joy look like? And being able to notice what our emotions look like at different intensities also helps us understand ourselves better. Because sometimes my joy at a 10 looks like my sadness at a 7. The tears are there, the body is ready to go. And if I'm not pausing to pay attention and I'm just looking at what my body is doing, I might actually get confused about what it is that I'm feeling. And so really being able to understand the nuances of our own emotional reactions. And then lastly, I think if we have no idea how to do any of this, watching others can be really helpful. So if TV is the best access that you have, watch people on TV, watch what it looks like when they're happy, when they're sad, when they're angry, and notice what they're saying, notice what their bodies are doing, notice what they're choosing to do, and how to behave. And that information might start to help you figure out what you do. You might notice some similarities, you might notice some patterns. And so if nothing else, learn from others and use those as benchmarks to help you figure out what's going on within you.
A reoccurring theme has come up twice during this panel. Dr. Dom mentioned a packet of vocabulary words that described a variety of emotions. And he said most people are very surprised that there were this many words to describe our feelings and emotions. And then you just mentioned the emotion wheel. And I'm somebody who talks to way more psychologists and psychiatrists than I even need to. And I don't describe my emotions more than, I feel good or I feel down. That's pretty much the breadth of what I disclose, which is I could do better. And I'm not coming after myself. This isn't the bully. This is me going, hey, what an opportunity to dig down a little deeper. And when instead of waking up and going, oh, I kind of feel sad today or I feel down, I can go, well, let's really get in there and see how I'm really feeling. This is very good. I really appreciate this insight. Dr. Lamb, a similar question for you, but wherever you want to take it.
Yeah, I think so many important points. Just to re-highlight, I think the first point that was made that is so important is the notion that most of us learned that our feelings are a problem, that they're kind of this messy, inconsequential thing that kind of gets in the way. And as you know, Kyle, I feel like it's kind of my life's mission to destigmatize not only mental health, but also feelings. All feelings, equal opportunity feelings, that if we can see that our feelings are actually this really important data set that we learn to ignore, we learn to instead get anxious or avoid, that if we can start to harness this, if we can start to pay attention to those little soldiers coming in, they're there to protect us, to give us information, to tell us how we feel about our environment on a way that's pre-conscious. So our feelings come up inside of us before our conscious mind is actually aware of what's happening or what we're really feeling. We may not even put a label on it yet, but our body is going to start to react. Now, most of us learn to shut that down and just get anxious like immediately before we have heat in the chest that might come up with anger. Anxiety comes in and shuts it down immediately. So it is a process of welcoming these feelings back in. And that can be, again, a difficult process, but so useful when what the information and the sensations that are coming up in our body are not to be feared, are not a problem, but are actually this really beautiful extra information that help us navigate the world. And so I so appreciate that comment about the notion that this is very different than how most of us were raised, and being explicit about the fact that we are saying your feelings are not only allowed or okay, they're actually wonderful, and they're super useful information. And this is so important. And so, Kyle, I think you also brought up, I'm touching on point. I was like, these are such great points. So I'm touching on a couple of things that really hit me. The other thing was what you said, Kyle, that I think is really important. As we're talking about this notion of labeling our feelings, getting really clear about what's going on so we can use that information to the best of our ability to make healthy actions, to choose what we want. There's two parts. One is, can I know me? And the other is, am I willing to let other people see me? So there's looking in and saying, do I know what I'm feeling? And sometimes that part in and of itself is very difficult. And that's a
Dr. Lamb, can you repeat that one more
yeah.
time, those two questions?
Yeah. So can I know me and what I'm feeling? And can I let you see me and what I'm feeling?
Wow.
So in certain types of psychotherapy, we can call this the cellar door and the front door. So some people may come into therapy and they may know that they're pissed at their wife, or right, they may have some sense of this. So the cellar door is open. They know what's in their cellar, but they're not going to let me in because they would never say anything bad about their wife. They love her. But how could I ever deal with this conflict and know what these feelings mean? Because I'm not allowed to have feelings in front of someone else.
Wow.
So there's getting to know what we feel. And then can I share this with someone else? Because often it has been in relationship that we've been asked to shut down our feelings. I may know I'm mad, but mom and dad can't tolerate it. So I shut that down and I'm fine. I'm good. Yep. I'm a little upset, but it's fine. So I think there's two big pieces to emotional intelligence, and that is getting to know ourselves. And then how do I communicate effectively with others? And I think people misconstrue the notion that sharing my feelings with others means letting them see me in a feeling, letting them see my physiology, when really that's the information inside of me for me. I need to know what I'm feeling. And then I can speak about it in any way that I want. I might be able to say, I might not have to be sobbing, but be able to tell my partner, I'm just really sad today. I just can't believe what's going on. And I just have been really moved by it. I can speak about it and ask for what I need. With anger, often people feel the need to show people that they're angry. The other person doesn't need to know that you're angry. What the person who needs to know you're angry is you. That's cellar door. I'm angry. Front door may be a communication that says, hey, I love you, but I need to let you know this. It really is making me angry that you keep, showing up late, or whatever the case may be. I can communicate about my emotions. And this is where that emotional intelligence shifts into what we might call social intelligence. There's my emotional intelligence about understanding feelings, and then social intelligence about how I then use that to connect with others and to build community and in my work relationships and my interpersonal relationships.
I love that. I love that. It really makes me, it makes me feel more able to be with my feelings. I don't know if that was the goal or purpose of it, but that is what that analogy metaphor did. Really, really fabulous, Dr. Lamb. Dr. Thusselm, were you about to say something? I don't want to.
It was. Thanks for reading my face. As Dr. Lamb was talking, one of the things that came to mind, because it seems like we inspire each other, what is the concept of dialectics, right? That it is possible for two realities that seem to be opposing one another to coexist, right? I can love you and I can be mad at you. My mom can make the best lasagna and today's lasagna can suck. It's allowed, they're allowed to coexist, but I think sometimes it feels as though we have to choose sides. We have to choose one narrative and we have to stick to it. But that's not the case at all. We are allowed to have multiple realities coexisting at once. I love this partner and I know that they are bad for me. And so being able to recognize that we can feel a lot of different things at once. We can have beliefs that seem oppositional, but are allowed to be real for us just gives us the space to acknowledge it. Because if we force ourselves to choose one, we're ignoring and dismissing and invalidating so many other things that we're thinking and that we're feeling. And so I think it's just really important to recognize that we can have multiple realities. And that's really one of the big foundations of dialectical behavior therapy, is recognizing that we can have multiple realities, much like we can have multiple feelings. I can be really excited and really sad and really happy and really angry all at the same time. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be all of them, and they're all valid.
Yeah. I know we got to get to viewer questions, but I just want to ask this selfishly. Yesterday, I went to yoga with a friend, and then we started talking about breath work, which I've never done. And he said, yeah, I went to this one breath work class, and like 3 or 4 people started crying. And I said, yeah, I've heard the same thing. And I said, if I was doing breath work, I don't know if I would cry if there were other people there. I think I would be reserved and closed off. So my question to both of you, or either of you, is that bad, or is that just my, I forget which door is which, but is that just my front door or whatever?
Yep. Yeah, sounds like your front door. And again, all of these things are completely individual, and that everyone actually gets to decide how they want to operate in the world. So some people don't want to look in their cellar and don't want to let other people in, and they actually get to choose that. Yeah. It may result in some symptoms. It may result in closed off relationships, but everybody gets to decide. And so it really is, Kyle, you've heard me say this a million times, but in individual therapy, when something comes up, I will often ask, is it a problem? And is it a problem you want to work on? Because if it's not a problem for you, I have no right to tell you you need to change something. You need to let everybody see your feelings or communicate. It's really up to the individual as to whether or not it's a problem, and if it's causing dysfunction in their lives or suffering or isolation, those kind of things. And only then can we start to look. And the hope is that when we look and see that something is a problem, that it's without judgment, that it's not a way to punish ourselves, but to say, curious, I wonder why I do this, and can I figure out maybe why, and is there a different way that might be more adaptive?
All right. Well, hey, thanks for the free therapy. Appreciate it. Let's go to some viewer questions, please. Whoever we got. Dr. Thuslam, you're up. How can you find a partner that has a high EQ? Yeah, too bad that's not a Tinder option. Or at least, what are the signs of a partner with a high EQ? I have a hard enough time finding a friend that has this depth, let alone a partner. Question of the decade, Dr. Thuslam.
Yeah. I mean, if we could all just walk around being able to read each other's emotional intelligence, I mean, life would be so much easier. Although all those who have a bit of work to do in that area might find themselves feeling a little more isolated. So maybe it's not a good thing. But I think if you're looking for a friend or a partner, recognizing someone who is able to kind of connect with you, hear what you're saying, someone who you feel validates your emotions is probably one of the easiest ways to recognize whether someone has emotional intelligence, or I guess we all have emotional intelligence, but higher emotional intelligence. As Dr. Lamb was saying, that person may not necessarily express their emotions or share their emotions in ways that are very visible, because that is their choice. But someone who's able to communicate their needs to you, and who's able to even kind of take a step back and pause to think about what their needs are, is also a really helpful sign to tell that someone is aware of their emotions and their emotional needs enough to be able to express those to you. So someone who you feel can, hear you and validate you in your emotions, and someone who can express their needs to you, I think would be a good place to start.
So I can already hear some people who have had a narcissist in their life saying, well, yeah, but they showed me all those things, on our first 2 dates, and that was not really who they were. Is there anything you could point out that might exhibit authentic high EQ rather than performative high EQ? Dr. Lamb, you're shaking your head, but Dr. Thuslam, do you have anything?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think if Dr. Lamb has a better answer, I will let Dr. Lamb answer this. But I think part of recognizing true high EQ is also looking at the dimensions of respect and mutual consideration. And so if you're being manipulated or deceived, you're probably not hearing that part of the self that's coming up, right? So you're probably not hearing needs being communicated respectfully and effectively. You're probably not hearing that support in a really true way. But I will throw it to Dr. Lamb, who probably has a better answer for that.
No,
I love
would
the
agree
answer.
100%. Yeah, no, I would agree exactly with what you said. And I think that it is about respect. And I think there's also a piece of this that is individuation, that we are working to be together, but also to be individuals. And so that means that I want to high emotional intelligence understand that you have a different mind, that you have different feelings, and that can be okay. And I was smiling because I will often, the quiz that I will give my couples is, can you tolerate hearing when your partner is angry with you? So it's not just being able to share our emotions, but emotional intelligence also means being able to receive others' emotions. So if somebody immediately gets defensive when you tell them, hey, this thing that you did made me angry, right? We're talking about, can I share my anger? On the receiving end, it's really helpful. And you have a partner with a high EQ if they can say, wow, I hate that made you angry. I want to hear more. I want to know what my role was. I have a different perspective. Are you open to me sharing that with you? So I think that the question about the narcissist is it's not just about being able to share emotions, but also receive emotions. And that's the piece that we often miss. I want to be able to talk about my feelings. Can I also hear and receive love from someone? Can I take that in and actually feel gratitude or feel warmth? Can I take in when someone's angry and not just get defensive and care and want to understand and respect the difference of our opinions or perspectives and be able to create space for that?
Yeah, really fabulous.
Let's
Go to another.
add to that, if that's
Please.
okay. I think that was fabulous, Dr. Lamb. And I think one of the things that we often get caught in is that kind of initial reaction, right? And so when we tell our partners or we tell anybody, it hurt me or it made me feel angry when this thing that you did happened, our partner may initially be defensive, but that's human, right? And so even if that's their initial reaction, being able to have them come back to us and recognize that they reacted defensively, and to take the time to really want to process that out with us, want to hear the feedback, and want to grow as an individual and as a couple dynamic, I think also is really good to pay attention to. And so if the person is kind of, put off in that initial interaction, I think a lot of us are going to see that, because a lot of us, again, are socialized to be uncomfortable with our emotions. And so giving the person a chance to hopefully come back and figure that out with us is also helpful.
Yeah, really fabulous. Let's go to another question while we still have the time here. This question for Dr. Lamb: how can trauma and epilepsy impact or influence emotional intelligence? Interesting question.
Yeah, I'm certainly not an epilepsy expert, but epilepsy in and of itself can really create a history of medical trauma for people. That if we are talking about grand mal seizures in social environments, there can be a ton of feelings that come up around this. And again, a ton of anxiety that comes up around this. So I'm not sure with this question if we're talking about medical trauma in regard to having a seizure disorder diagnosis. But I think that anything that we have been through in our lives that is difficult, that has challenged us, can become part of our story that we integrate and allow us to more deeply understand our feelings. For better or worse, most of the deepest, most insightful, emotionally intelligent people that I know have been through a ton, and they've had to have something to push against, to work on, to get to know, gosh, this thing is coming up, and all I'm doing is getting anxious. I have to really work to kind of work through these feelings, allow myself to open up to this again. And so I think that initially a big trauma can have us want to avoid, have us want to kind of numb. But if we can make that choice of deciding to do the work, it really can become the nidus or the source from which we can really grow our emotional intelligence, because we've got a clear emotionally laden event and lifelong diagnosis in some people's case of having to navigate this and having to kind of really start to pay attention not only to physical cues, but also emotional cues. And this can go hand in hand for growth, or we can kind of shut down. And so the hope is that when we have something that has been traumatic in our lives, that if we can have support and we can engage with ourselves in a way that allows us to use that as again, a source of growth and a source of, okay, from this place forward, I can learn about how I'm feeling. I can learn about my body, and I can start to integrate this story into my life.
Really great. We're going to get to one more question. I do want to thank the 135 of you who pressed that little thumbs up button. It helps us spread this video to more people. All of your support really means a lot to me, and it really does. Not only do the doctors work very, very hard to bring us this great information and insight, but there are a lot of people behind the scenes who are all on this live panel right now, but you don't see them. We got Wade working the camera. We got Bridget monitoring comments. We got Mandy taking your questions. We thank you for helping us spread this information. We can only do it if people watch, and you help spread this to more people to watch. Let's go to our final question. This question is for both of y'all. I'm looking for a better term than resilience to help my colleagues with wellness and mental health at work. It seems to have become a bigger trigger word for it's your fault. I've tried using the term, quote, individual internal factors that help you manage stress, and sometimes that goes over better. Any other ideas how to address this topic? Dr. Lamb, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Dr. Thuslin.
Sure. So if I'm hearing the question correctly, kind of ways that we can describe what it means to be resilient within the workplace without putting blame, without putting stigma or telling people just to push through. And so I think that if we're not building resilient skills, I think that this topic of the talk is actually a perfect way to talk about this, that we want to build our emotional intelligence. We want to build our capacity to engage with each other in an effective way. So very often when people are squeamish around mental health terms or even kind of catchphrases that are popular right now, we want to get clear about what we're actually talking about doing. And so being really specific can be helpful about that, to be able to say, what are the skills or what is it that I'm talking about, and how is this going to serve us as we move forward? Often people who start these conversations in the workplace can get mired in people who maybe their front door is really closed and locked, and they don't want to talk about emotions. They don't want to talk about feelings. They don't want you to go woo woo or talk anything. So we're going to need to use a different type of language. And so this is where our own emotional intelligence can be very helpful, because if I'm talking to a bunch of accountants, right, I'm going to talk about calculating the different factors that are coming in. I'm going to use the word calculating. I'm going to use language that's going to help them see in their own train of thinking why this would be useful to them. And so we have to find the hook if we're trying to help people understand. If I'm talking to a physician who's really kind of science-based, I'm going to use analogies that have to do with bacteria, or, we want to open the abscess so that the healing can happen, so that the person can actually relate and doesn't feel stigmatized or feels like they have to open up in any way that they don't want to. So it's really important that we use the right language to meet the people where we are. So I don't have enough information about this specific situation, but in a work environment, working towards positive goals, what we want to get out of this may be way more well received than we're doing this thing really badly and you're part of what's doing it badly. People will start to get defensive. So if we talk about, hey, we all want to make this workplace a healthy, thriving environment. I learned about this thing called emotional intelligence, where we can start to kind of use some tools to communicate a little bit better, make sure we're setting our boundaries. You know what your boss or your HR department, what they care about. And these things fit in those pathways, but we have to find the language that helps connect to the desired outcome.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not making the correlation completely here with what I'm about to say, but when I used to be an animal trainer, and when I would explain animal training techniques to people, I would first want to know what their job was. Yes. Because I was like, I've got to use something that's in your wheelhouse. And honestly, if you're going to try to explain something to me, you got to know something about me, because I need the metaphor, the analogy, the vocabulary. It really is helpful. Dr. Thuslin, anything to add on that?
Yeah, you know, when I heard when I heard you read the question, Kyle, one of the things that I thought about is the accusation that sometimes happens, right? You need to be more resilient. You need to
Yes.
come at things like it's the fact that you're upset about this or you can't handle the stress is a you problem.
Yeah.
When so often it's not, right? And
Yeah.
so I think that it could also be a reason why the term resilient becomes a bit of a trigger word in a workplace, because if people are kind of using it in an accusatory way, it can be really harmful. And
Yeah,
without
or they think, and Dr. Thessum, I've interrupted you a lot tonight, and I do apologize for that. But you just get me excited about stuff. Or they think when they hear resilience, they hear their definition of resilience is grit. And they go, well, I've been gritting it for 18 months. I can't grit anymore. And so being clear with what we mean by resilient would be critical for me to understand that if I was the employee getting this feedback. Okay, sorry, Dr. Thessum, go ahead.
That's okay. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Kyle. I think when we're talking about resilience, having that common understanding of what it is, and because it's so popularized now, I think a lot of people do think about it as like the suck it up and keep going kind of resilience, when that's not really what we mean most of the time when we're talking about resilience. And so I think, and again, I don't know the context of this in this particular workplace, but I think being able to talk about mutual respect and collaboration and trust within the workplace helps us identify where there are opportunities for learning, where there are opportunities for better communication. And those exercises help build the emotional intelligence of a team, right? It's really exploring that relationship dynamics part of emotional intelligence. And while that requires people to be motivated to engage in that process, switching the language to more HR type language might give a bit of an opportunity to really explore, if it is coming from an accusational perspective, where those accusations are coming from. Is it a person who's using their power and privilege to bully others? Is it someone who is misinterpreting what's going on in the workplace? But if we don't pause to have those conversations, if we don't have trust in the workplace, if we don't have respect in the workplace, then terms like resilience can be used to further marginalize, further bully, further isolate.
Thank you both so much for being here and sharing this. Earlier today, I had a YouTube live with Dr. Lamb, and I think during that video, I said, or someone made the point of saying something like, "So-and-so always makes me feel this way," and I brought up that I don't really love it when people say someone makes me feel this way. So I can't say you two make me feel good about doing my job, but I will say that I feel good doing this when I get to speak with people like you. So thank you both for being here. It's just fabulous. It just helps my life. I just had 90 minutes of just fabulous insight and education. So thank you so much, both of you.
Always a pleasure, Kyle. Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
And as for all of you, thank you. We went to 135 to 199 of those little thumb up things. That's pretty good. So thank you all who have supported this video and this channel and MedCircle over the years. We have a few more days of Mental Health Month left. We have some great offers and specials over on MedCircle.com or watch.medcircle.com or on the MedCircle app. So there's plenty of ways to access more of these types of Q&As with doctors, educational series, and more. Thank you all for being here. I so appreciate you. I wish I could look at every single one of you in the face and say thank you, but I'll just look right at this camera instead and say thank you. Remember, whatever you're going through, you got this.